For the API client, let's go ahead and bring in the client, which is the thing we're going to be testing, API client. And then for each one of these tests, let's just get rid of that to-do right there. And we'll come and format that around there. And then for each test, we also need the function defined right there. And they're all going to be async functions because the client is an async function itself. So with that, in this first test, we're going to be calling the client, and we want to call it at some test endpoint. And we'll need to await this, and we'll get a result back so that we can verify that we can make a GET request to a given endpoint. So let's save this, and we're going to get this error that says get attr info e not found bookshelf.jk. Okay, so yeah, that's a little bit confusing. What's happening here is our client is attempting to make a request, window.fetch, to the API URL and the endpoint. And if we look at the API URL, that is defined in our .env, which is set to bookshelf.jk. So that's what the bookshelf.jk thing is all about. And basically this error is just saying, hey, you tried to make a network request, but that network request failed because there is no server listening at that address. And whether there's a server listening at that address or not, I don't want to actually make that request. So I'm going to mock that request out, and we're going to use a server that we already have configured in this project. So I'm going to import the server from test server. And if we dive into that, we'll go to test server. Then we'll see that we're using MSW node setup server, and we call setup server with these handlers. These handlers are actually what we use in the real app to handle network requests. So we have handlers for all of our app's network requests right in here, all being set up using MSW REST. So if we go back to our test server, we create a server with all of those handlers. So if we hit any of those endpoints in our tests, then it would work properly. But we don't want to hit those endpoints in these tests. We want to make one-off handlers for each one of these tests so we can test it more thoroughly. So we'll do that, and that's why we export the server here. We also export everything from MSW, which we'll take advantage of here pretty soon. Just because that server's set up doesn't mean that it's listening for requests though. So let's get this started. We're going to say before all our tests start, we'll say server.listen. That'll get the server ready to listen for any requests that we make. And then we'll say after all of those tests, we'll close the server. And then we want to listen for this particular request. Now the client is making this request at the API URL / this endpoint that we give. So let's grab that same API URL from our API client. So I'll copy this and paste it right here. And then I need to create a special one-off handler for this test. So we'll say server.use, and we're expecting a GET request. So we need to configure our server to listen for that GET request. So I'm going to import the REST utility from the server, which is coming from MSW. Because remember, the test server is re-exporting everything from MSW. So with this REST utility, I can now say rest.get, and we're going to listen at API URL / test endpoint. Let's go ahead and make this a variable right here. And then we'll interpolate that here, and then pass it here. Great, so when there's a request made to this URL, then we'll handle it with this async handler that takes the request, response, and context utility. And this will simply return a call to the response with the context telling that response to send some JSON. And let's see, well, let's make a mock result here that has a mock value of value. And then we'll pass that mock result right here. And now, if everything's wired up properly, this result should be equal to that mock result. So let's try that. Expect result to equal that mock result. Great, things are working awesome. Now let's make sure we can actually break this so that we know that we're testing what we think we are. And if I were to change this and say, hey, we're going to make a post request rather than a GET, then I'm going to get a network request failed because we're making the wrong type of request. So we are testing what we think we are, and it is giving us confidence that the client can make GET requests to a given endpoint. Now we've set up our server to listen for this endpoint right here, but I don't want that to mess up my other tests and have my other tests call this handler. So I'm going to add one more hook here called before each. And here I'm going to say server reset handlers. So between every test, we'll just get rid of all of the one-off handlers that we added. And our tests are passing. So in review, what we wanted to do here is call the client with a given endpoint and make sure that it makes a GET request to that endpoint and returns the result that's returned from that endpoint. To do all of this, we had to use an MSW server that we had set up in this project already. We also brought in the client, of course, and the API URL that the client's using. We started the server before the test run. We set it up to stop after the tests are finished. And we set it up to clear all of these runtime handlers between each test. And you know what? I just realized we should probably make this an after each so that we clear it immediately after each one of the tests. It doesn't make a huge difference whether we use before or after, but it makes more sense to me that we would use after to say that we clear them after each test, because the test is the thing that set this up in the first place. And then we created an endpoint that we wanted to hit. We created a mock result that we wanted to return. We awaited the client at that endpoint, and we verified the result we got back from the client is the same one that we send back from the server.